I'm Stephanie Dominguez, and I'm a senior attorney with Universal Orlando Resort.
Okay, great. Today we'll go over a few questions, starting with business entity first. We'll discuss whether or not Universal Studios Orlando is a sole proper proprietorship, partnership, LLC, or a corporation.
Okay, and with a big corporation like Universal, the answer is not really that easy. So the way that our company is set up is we have a parent company, which is Comcast,
Right.
that recently acquired us, that recently bought us in the past few years. And then under the Comcast umbrella is NBC Universal. Okay, so those are both corporations. They issue shares, they have stockholders, just, kind of what you would think of with a corporation.
Right.
Under the NBC Universal umbrella, there are dozens and dozens of entities because we have lots of different businesses. And for, a number of reasons, it makes sense to kind of separate those out. You wouldn't want to put kind of your entire business just in one bucket, because if you get a lawsuit or if there is, a big class action or something like that, that liability would really hurt us if it was
Right.
all in one place.
So it's best to kind of separate
Yeah.
them out.
So even though we have a theme park in Hollywood, for instance, they have a completely different entity than we do here. So the formal kind of official name for Universal Orlando Resort is Universal City Development Partners Limited. People don't know that.
It's way different.
Yeah. And what's interesting about that structure is that it is a partnership.
Okay.
Now, the way that I look at partnerships is a traditional partnership is it really is like a marriage. Okay, you have let me just qualify. It's like a marriage if we're talking about two entities here,
Right.
because the partnerships can get a little bit more complex. So in a partnership, it's like a marriage because you share everything. You share the decision making, you share the liabilities, you share the financial benefits. Dissolving a partnership is much like a divorce. It is. Some people have actually told me who've dissolved partnerships that it's easier to get a divorce than it is to dissolve a partnership. But with the sole proprietorship and with a partnership, you don't need to really tell anybody about it. You don't need to tell the state about it. You don't need to file special forms, anything like that. The partnership here is what's called a limited partnership. So what that means is Universal, that entity that I just told you, it's always doing business as Universal to keep it simple.
Yeah.
So our partnership means it's a limited partnership. So what that means is one of the partners, which is us, Universal, we get to make the decisions. We have control of all the operations. We do kind of all the day-to-day decision making, with the benefit that we have these kind of silent partners, other entities that provide, a financial support, that provide financing, that provide a lot of kind of the back end stuff.
Okay.
So that's kind of a unique setup. So most people would think that we're just a corporation, but it's a little bit more complex than that.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a surprising.
Yeah. And on one of the questions here, it asks, what would my favorite entity be? It would definitely be the LLC, which I'm sure you've heard.
Yes.
Because that is a great tool where you can, you can have the benefit of escaping personal liability, as well as getting tax benefits without having to actually file a corporation, where it gets just very cumbersome, where you have to issue shares, you have to have a board, you have to have a lot more kind of teeth in the game.
Right.
An LLC does require you to file with the state, and I think there's maybe an annual report that also needs to get filed, but it's not an expensive entity to form, and most people can just do it themselves.
That's easy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And with the corporation, that's probably the most complex. It's probably the most difficult to keep up with.
Right.
But if you're a big corporation, it makes sense because, again, you ultimately want to have shareholders.
Right. Yeah.
And again, for tax reasons, there can be strategic reasons why you choose a corporation.
Yeah, to keep things separate.
Yeah.
Money-wise.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Next question would be based off of our contracts. I know we'd say we keep this one a little generic.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, as with any big company, our contracts are really the backbone of what we do,
right?
Particularly in the legal department. But establishing those relationships with, a variety of vendors, especially in a business like ours where we have, everything from leases that we'll do when we're leasing certain properties, like
right.
out in City Walk, to food providers, to merchandise, and just about anything that you can think of. Real estate, when we're making new hotels, contracts are absolutely the backbone of those relationships. It's really hard to say what would be like kind of the most important one, because they're all contribute
right.
to
they
our
all
business.
Probably vary between which partners you're writing the contracts up for.
Yeah, and we try to keep things as standard as possible. So things like indemnification and limitation of liability, and insurance, and how we treat our third-party licensors, like those types of things, we try to keep as standard as possible. But because we deal with such a wide variety and things like that you might not even think of, like for instance, I've worked on a contract recently with a consultant who's a mathematician, who's going to help us come up with a model to kind of forecast attendance rates at the parks.
That's awesome.
So yeah, so in that situation, it's just one consultant and maybe like a 2-person firm. So we wouldn't want to hit him with our 45-page
right
agreement.
Yeah.
So we understand that, and practically speaking, to help business run, we do make those kind of adjustments.
Nice.
So, yeah.
That's kind of cool. That's something you don't think about for a theme park.
Definitely. Yeah.
Different types of contracts. Okay, next one would be based on our intellectual properties. Which ones we see most valuable? How did we acquire those legal rights to those intellectual properties? And I think, same thing, keeping it a little generic.
Sure,
we could maybe just talk about more of the relationship with them.
Yeah. So our intellectual property is absolutely essential to helping us run and to making sure that our guests have such a great interactive experience out there. So Universal actually owns very little intellectual property. We license most of it.
Right.
So these agreements are very complex, and a lot of them have very kind of strict requirements for usage. So in some cases, our IP licensors will say, well, we don't want to be mixed with your other IP. We just want total billing when we're used in marketing.
Right.
Some don't want to be used in, for instance, we had a contract recently with Snapchat. So some of our IP didn't want to be used on the geofilters on Snapchat. So just things like that we're always very sensitive to that, because those relationships are so essential to making our parks to making our parks work. We have recently acquired DreamWorks, which is a really interesting opportunity for us, because that's IP that we're going to own.
Right.
So that'll be putting us in a much different situation as far as just having more freedom and ability to use however we want.
Definitely.
With our new theme park that's opening up in June, the Volcano Bay Water Park down the street, all of that was created internally. So that's the first time that we're going to have a park where there's no licensed IP.
Yes.
So legally that makes our job a lot easier, because we don't have to check with our licensed partners. We don't have to get any sign-offs whenever we're using that material in any kind of marketing spots or creative. we can just run with it.
Right.
So that from that perspective, it is a lot easier. We do have patents. Actually, when you go out, there's a whole wall that you can see that lists all of our patents that we're very proud of. Different technologies to help the rides go smoother.
Right.
And, different systems and engineering type patents that, again, they're displayed there. You're more than welcome to take a picture or two of them. And trade secrets, obviously, that's an important function of any company, really. And trademarks, we have an entire division. They're based out in California, who research and register all the different taglines and all the different trademarks that you see for us. So.
Great. That'll be nice not to worry about one park, at least. Not too much. So we'll skip down to litigations. If there were any lawsuits or maybe, what if scenarios.
So generally speaking, because our parks are open to, millions of guests every year, our biggest priority is to keep them safe and, to make sure that experience that they're having is thrilling, but also that no one is going to get hurt.
Right.
So, those kind of health and safety issues would probably be at the top of the list of things that we're trying to avoid, And then from more of a transactional side would be those like intellectual property infringement situations that, happen from time to time. So if we had a vendor or a partner who was, using intellectual property in the wrong way, like if they were using Harry Potter or Marvel in a way that they did not have permission for, we would still be liable for that. We take on that responsibility.
Gotcha.
So that's something, again, any kind of intellectual property litigation can just can really set you back.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And then another issue that's really coming to the forefront is privacy and data. Starting in 2018, there's a whole new privacy regime that's taking place in Europe. And because we're an international company, we're going to be subject to it. And it's funny how the Europeans look at the U.S. as far as privacy is concerned, because they think like, we just leak our information all over the place, that we're
everything's
awful.
Out in the open.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what we're going to have to do is really kind of up our standards, as a company and really like as a country, because to comply and to do business internationally, we need to meet their standards. So you'll definitely see some changes as far as when you're on our websites, when you're on our social platforms, the information that you give, there'll be a lot more like disclaimers. Any of the boxes that you have to check will not be pre-checked. You'll have to actually go in and check. Yeah. So, the differences will be subtle, but they're important, because if you don't make them for this particular regulation that's going in place, it's something like, I want to say it's like 10% of your revenue is like the penalty for not complying.
Wow.
So for a company that is, $26 billion
right.
a year,
definitely
that would be painful. So.
Well, that's cool to think that you guys are looking all the way into 2018 already.
Oh yeah.
To avoiding any setbacks.
Yeah, and I think that's that's pretty typical for most legal departments. You do have to kind of think ahead. You do have to kind of always think about the worst case scenario.
Right.
So that's why most people, when a lawyer walks in the room, they're like, oh no, there goes the fun.
Here we go. All right, well, great. I think our last question will be on our company's ethics and the ethical culture that you have. I know, I'm sure in the legal department you are tip-top shape for ethical culture, but...
Well, we certainly, like to believe that.
Right.
And particularly in the kind of law that we practice in this department, which has a lot to do with kind of marketing and consumer-facing materials. I'd say we're particularly sensitive to what the customer sees and what the customer's experience is. And because of that, we do try to have a very high standard and to, really make sure that, that there's, I would say that we're very just transparent and that we have clarity, so we don't try to use like a lot of legalese. We don't try to, make things more complicated than they have to be.
Right.
And I think that, that kind of goes to that culture of ethics that I think really the whole company has, from Comcast all the way down to us. So.
Definitely. I agree. Well, thank you. I appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
These answers were more surprising than I imagined.
Well, good.